In the autumn of 1453, 6 months after the fall of Constantinople, a letter arrived at the convent of the Theotokos. It carried a chilling warning: what follows is not martyrdom in the old sense. It is something else, something that takes longer, something that leaves you alive, but kills you from the inside. 14 days later, Ottoman forces arrived. What happened to the nuns there was not a massacre, but a systematic process of spiritual destruction so devastating that Western history has largely chosen to forget it. Welcome to the dark truth about the fate of Byzantine nuns after the collapse of the empire. In the autumn of 1453, 6 months after Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces, a messenger arrived at the convent of the Theotokos in the hills above Thessaloniki, carrying a letter sealed with the mark of the Byzantine Patriarch. Sister Theodora, the abbess, who had led the community for 23 years, broke the seal with hands that she tried to keep steady. She read the letter once, then read it again, then looked up at the 37 women gathered in the chapel waiting for her to speak. The letter was brief. It informed them that all remaining Byzantine territories in the region would soon be under Ottoman control. It advised that convents should evacuate immediately, that the sisters should scatter to their families, or flee west to Venice or Rome while there was still time. It acknowledged that many would choose to stay to keep their vows to trust in divine protection. And then, in words that seemed to struggle to convey their meaning even as they were written, the letter warned that what followed was not martyrdom in the old sense. It was something else, something that takes longer, something that leaves you alive, but destroys you from within. Sister Theodora did not share that final sentence with her sisters. Instead, she told them they would vote on whether to flee or to remain. The vote took place the next morning after prayers. 34 sisters chose to stay bound by their vows and by faith that God would protect His faithful servants. 3 younger women, barely 20 years old, chose to attempt the journey west. Theodora gave them what money the convent possessed and watched them leave at dawn, wondering if she would ever learn whether they reached safety. 14 days later, Ottoman forces reached the convent. And what happened to Sister Theodora and the women who stayed with her? What happened to thousands of nuns across dozens of convents throughout the collapsing Byzantine territories over the following decades reveals something profound about conquest, about faith, and systematic oppression that historical records preserve only in fragmentary forms across Ottoman archives, Vatican correspondence, and scattered accounts from ransomed captives. What you are about to learn is not legend or exaggeration. It is documented in sources that historians have been reluctant to discuss in detail because the systematic nature of what occurred seems almost designed to destroy not just bodies, but souls, not just individuals, but the very concept of religious resistance. If you want to understand how conquest worked, not just on battlefields but in the methodical destruction of faith and identity, how women religious were specifically targeted as symbols of defeated Christianity, how systematic methods of conversion and erasure operated across decades and territories, then you need to watch this entire video. Let me tell you what happened when the Ottoman soldiers reached the convent of the Theotokos, because understanding this specific case helps us understand the patterns that were repeated across the collapsing Byzantine world. The Ottoman forces that arrived at the convent were not a random raiding party, but a structured military unit operating under specific orders regarding how to handle religious institutions in newly conquered territories. The commander was a man named Mehmed Bey. And according to Ottoman military records preserved in the archives of Istanbul, He had been specifically instructed on how to deal with Christian monastic communities. These instructions were not about simple destruction. The Ottomans were building an empire, not just conducting raids, and empire building required more sophisticated approaches to conquered populations. When Mehmed Bey's forces reached the convent gates, they did not immediately attack. Instead, the commander sent a messenger to inform the abbess that the convent was now under Ottoman authority and that the inhabitants had three choices. They could convert to Islam and be integrated into Ottoman society with certain protections. They could pay the jizya tax and continue practicing Christianity under specific restrictions. Or they could face the consequences designated for those who resisted the Sultan's authority. Sister Theodora, standing at the gate with several of her sisters behind her, gave the answer that her vows demanded. "We are the brides of Christ. We cannot accept another faith, and we possess nothing with which to pay tribute. Our lives are in God's hands." The commander's response was immediate and methodical. Ottoman forces broke through the convent gates using tools they had brought specifically for this purpose, not cannon, which would be excessive for such a small target, but heavy timbers used as battering rams and axes to break the wooden doors. The assault took less than an hour. By sunset, the convent was under Ottoman control, and the sisters were gathered in the courtyard. What happened next followed a pattern that appears repeatedly in historical records from this period. The women were not immediately harmed or violated. Instead, they were held in the courtyard under guard while the Ottoman forces systematically searched the convent for several things. Valuables that could be confiscated as legitimate spoils of war, religious items that would be catalogued and either destroyed or sent to Ottoman authorities as evidence of the conquest, and documentation letters records anything that might reveal connections to resistance movements or to Western powers. The sisters spent that first night in the courtyard forbidden from entering the chapel or their cells, given minimal food and water, subjected to what we would now recognize as a deliberate process of disorientation and demoralization. They were surrounded by soldiers speaking a language most of them didn't understand. They could see smoke rising from inside the convent, where soldiers were burning items considered heretical. They could hear the sounds of destruction as furnishings were broken apart and structures were damaged. They were being forced to witness the desecration of everything they had dedicated their lives to protecting. This first phase, the initial capture and the night of disorientation, was described in a letter written years later by one of the three sisters who had chosen to flee west. She had maintained correspondence with a family in Thessaloniki, who through various channels learned fragments of what happened and passed this information to Venice, where it eventually reached her. The letter preserved in Venetian archives describes how the psychological assault began before any physical harm, how the women were made to feel powerless and abandoned before the next phase of their ordeal began. On the second day, the systematic processing began. This is where we need to understand that the Ottoman Empire had developed sophisticated methods for dealing with conquered populations. Methods that were more complex than simple violence or destruction. The empire needed to establish control, extract resources, and prevent future resistance. And these goals required different approaches for different types of conquered peoples. For nuns, women who had taken vows of celibacy and dedicated themselves to Christian religious life, the Ottoman authorities had specific policies that were designed to achieve several objectives simultaneously. First, these women represented powerful symbols of Christian faith and resistance. Converting them or breaking them served propaganda purposes, demonstrating that even the most dedicated Christians would ultimately submit to Ottoman power. Second, many of these women came from wealthy or influential families, making them potentially valuable for ransom or for forcing cooperation from their relatives. Third, the knowledge that nuns faced specific fates after capture served to terrorize other Christian communities into surrendering without resistance. The Sisters of the Theotokos convent were separated into groups based on age and apparent health. The oldest women over 50, who would be considered too old for certain purposes, were separated first. The youngest and healthiest women, roughly between 15 and 35, were placed in a second group. Those in between were divided based on apparent strength and condition. This categorization process was methodical and recorded with Ottoman scribes noting down numbers and basic descriptions. Each group faced different fates, and understanding these different trajectories helps us understand the systematic nature of how the Ottoman Empire processed captured religious women. The eldest group, including Sister Theodora, who was 56 years old, was given one final opportunity to convert. An interpreter explained that if they would recite the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, they would be allowed to live out their remaining years in relative peace, possibly in service to Ottoman households, where their literacy and domestic skills would be valued. Every single woman in this group refused. Sister Theodora's response, recorded by the interpreter in his report, was, "I have been Christ's bride for 34 years. I will not abandon him in my final years to purchase a few more breaths of air." The other elderly sisters expressed similar sentiments, their refusals ranging from simple no to more elaborate declarations of faith. The Ottoman commander's response to these refusals was neither immediate execution nor torture in the conventional sense. Instead, these women were confined to a section of the convent that had been damaged during the initial assault, given minimal food and water, and essentially left to survive or not as their bodies determined. This was not mercy but calculated cruelty, allowing them to die slowly from deprivation rather than making martyrs through quick execution. Ottoman records indicate this approach was preferred for elderly religious captives because it avoided creating symbolic martyrs while still achieving the goal of eliminating resistance. Sister Theodora died 17 days after the convent fell, according to accounts that eventually reached Venice. She was buried in an unmarked location, somewhere in the hills around Thessaloniki. Her grave was never identified or marked with any Christian symbol. The other elderly sisters died over the following weeks. Their deaths attributed in Ottoman records simply to natural causes following capture, a bureaucratic euphemism that appears repeatedly in documents from this period. But it was the younger sisters, the women of childbearing age, who were healthy and strong, who faced the fates that historical sources describe in terms suggesting they were considered worse than death. Let me tell you about what happened to them, because this is where the systematic nature of Ottoman policy toward captured religious women becomes most evident and most disturbing. The 23 younger sisters, ranging in age from 16 to 38, were placed under guard and prepared for transport. Unlike the elderly sisters who were left in place, these women were considered valuable enough to be sent to Constantinople, where their fates would be determined by higher Ottoman authorities. The journey itself was designed as part of their psychological breaking. They would be marched for days across territories that had once been Christian, but were now under Ottoman control. Visible symbols of defeated Christianity being paraded before populations who needed to understand that resistance was futile. Before the march began, the women were stripped of their religious habits, the distinctive clothing that marked them as nuns, and dressed in simple, rough garments. Their heads were shorn or uncovered, violating the customs of modesty they had observed their entire religious lives. They were bound together with ropes not tightly enough to prevent walking, but enough to make clear that they were prisoners without freedom of movement, and they were placed under the guard of soldiers who had been specifically instructed regarding how to treat them. Here we need to understand something important about Ottoman policy that appears consistently in historical records. There were rules, procedures, and bureaucratic structures governing how conquered peoples were treated. This was not simply chaos or individual soldiers acting on impulse. The Ottoman Empire had developed systematic approaches to processing captives, and these approaches were implemented with remarkable consistency across different campaigns in different regions. For captured Christian religious women, the rules were specific. They were not to be violated or abused during transport in ways that would damage their value as potential converts or as ransom subjects. They were to be kept alive and relatively healthy. They were to be psychologically intimidated and demoralized, but not physically destroyed. These rules existed not out of mercy, but out of calculated imperial policy. These women were assets to be processed, not resources to be carelessly destroyed. The march from Thessaloniki to Constantinople took 12 days, according to records that documented the movement of military units and captives during this period. The sisters walked between 15 and 20 miles per day, given minimal food and water, sleeping on the ground at night under guard, forbidden from speaking to each other or from praying aloud. When they tried to pray silently or to comfort each other through gestures, they were struck with sticks. Not severely enough to cause serious injury, but enough to establish that even these small resistances would be punished. One account that survived from this period comes from a merchant named Paolo Contarini, a Venetian, who was traveling through Ottoman territories under safe passage and who witnessed a group of captive women being marched toward Constantinople. He recorded in his diary that the women were dressed in rags, their heads uncovered in shame, bound together like beasts, yet walking with dignity that spoke of their former station. He noted that when he attempted to speak to them in Greek, offering water from his own supplies, the Ottoman guards prevented contact and moved the captives quickly away. Contarini's diary entry, preserved in Venetian archives, continues with his observations. I learned from my interpreter that these were nuns from a conquered convent being transported to Constantinople, where their fates would be determined. The interpreter himself, a Greek convert to Islam, told me that some would be offered conversion and integration into Ottoman households if they possessed useful skills. Others would be ransomed to their families if their families were wealthy and willing to pay. Those who refused conversion, and whose families could not pay, would face fates he would not describe, saying only that the Sultan's mercy extended only to those who submitted to Allah's will. This account gives us insight into the three potential paths that awaited captured nuns when they reached Constantinople: conversion and integration, ransom and release, or what the sources obliquely describe as discipline for those who persist in error. Let me tell you about each of these paths in detail, because understanding them reveals the systematic nature of how the Ottoman Empire processed religious captives. When the sisters from Thessaloniki arrived in Constantinople after 12 days of marching, they were taken not to a prison, but to a specific facility that existed for processing captives from conquered territories. This facility, located near the imperial district, was essentially a sorting and evaluation center where captured people would be categorized and assigned to various fates based on their characteristics and potential value. The evaluation process was bureaucratic and methodical. Ottoman scribes recorded each woman's name, approximate age, place of origin, family connections, if known skills such as literacy or medical knowledge, and physical condition. This information was compiled into registers that were maintained by Ottoman administrators, and some of these registers survive in archives today, providing documentary evidence of these practices. A scholar named Halil İnalcık examined these records and found numerous entries for Christian religious captives, with notations about their processing and eventual disposition. After evaluation, the sisters were given what was framed as an opportunity, but was actually a test designed to identify who might be broken through pressure versus who would require more intensive methods. They were brought before an Islamic scholar, an imam, who had been specifically assigned to work with Christian captives, and through interpreters, they were given detailed explanations of Islam and offered the chance to convert voluntarily. The imam's approach, according to accounts from the period, was initially gentle and persuasive rather than threatening. He would explain Islamic theology, emphasizing the continuities between Christianity and Islam, arguing that both faiths worshipped the same God and that Muslims honor Jesus as a prophet. He would describe the benefits of conversion freedom from captivity, potential marriage into respectable Ottoman families, protection under Islamic law, the opportunity to live normal lives rather than remaining in limbo as unconverted captives. These sessions could last for days or weeks, with the imam meeting repeatedly with small groups of captives working to identify who might be persuaded and who remained absolutely resistant. Modern historians examining these practices have noted their psychological sophistication. The combination of reasonable theological arguments, promises of practical benefits, implicit threats about what awaited those who refused, and the grinding pressure of uncertainty and captivity all worked together to break down resistance over time. Some women faced with this combination of pressures did convert. Historical records indicate that perhaps 20 to 30% of captured nuns eventually accepted Islam, though the sincerity of these conversions is obviously impossible to determine across centuries. Some may have genuinely been convinced by theological arguments. Some may have been exhausted by captivity and willing to say words that would end their suffering even if they maintained private Christian faith. Some may have calculated that accepting Islam at least gave them a chance to eventually escape or to maintain some contact with Christian communities. For the sisters from Thessaloniki, 3 of the 23 eventually agreed to convert after 6 weeks of daily sessions with the imam. Their names, Anna Maria and Irene, appear in Ottoman conversion records with notations that they recited the Shahada and were given new Islamic names. They were subsequently transferred to Ottoman households, where they would serve and potentially be married to Muslim men, their lives continuing, but their Christian religious identities officially erased. The other 20 sisters refused all inducements and arguments. Their resistance was not based on theological debate. Few of them were educated enough to engage in sophisticated religious disputation, but on simple, absolute faith in their vows. They had dedicated themselves to Christ. They had taken vows of celibacy that could not be undone. And they understood their religious identity as fundamental to who they were. Asking them to convert was asking them to cease to exist in any meaningful sense. And they could not do it. For these resistant women, the Ottoman authorities shifted to what sources describe as more intensive methods of encouraging conversion. These methods were systematic and calculated, designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical deprivation, psychological pressure, and the demonstration that their God would not intervene to save them from suffering. The women were moved to a different facility, one that was essentially a prison, though not called that in Ottoman records. They were placed in small cells, sometimes individually, and sometimes in small groups with minimal light and no contact with the outside world. Food was reduced to subsistence levels, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to maintain strength. They were forbidden from engaging in Christian prayer or rituals with guards instructed to interrupt any attempts at worship. This phase could last for months. The goal was not to extract information, as might be the case with political prisoners, but to simply wear down resistance through the grinding misery of confinement and deprivation. Ottoman authorities understood that absolute faith could often withstand dramatic persecution, but might erode under extended mundane suffering. By making the women's lives continuously uncomfortable without resorting to spectacular tortures that might create martyrs, the authorities hoped to reach a point where conversion seemed like the only rational choice to end suffering. Accounts from ransomed captives who were held in similar facilities describe the psychological toll of this confinement. Isolation from community, which had been central to their religious life, was particularly devastating. The inability to mark time through the rhythms of religious observance left them disoriented. The constant low-level discomfort of hunger, cold, and poor sanitation wore away at physical and mental strength. And the knowledge that this could continue indefinitely, that no rescue was coming, that their choice was either conversion or potentially years or decades of this existence, created psychological pressure that was difficult to resist. Some women broke under this pressure. After months of confinement, exhausted and despairing, they would agree to say the words required for conversion. Ottoman records note these conversions with the same bureaucratic precision as voluntary ones, marking the date and assigning new names, then transferring the women to new situations in Ottoman society. But some women, including most of the sisters from Thessaloniki, did not break. Their faith, rather than eroding under pressure, seemed to harden into something that even extreme deprivation could not crack. These women became what Ottoman records describe as incorrigible captives, people who would not convert regardless of inducement or pressure, who maintained their resistance, even when that resistance seemed completely futile. For these absolutely resistant captives, Ottoman policy offered one final possibility before resorting to permanent imprisonment or execution. They could be offered for ransom to their families or to Western religious institutions that sometimes paid to free captured Christians. Let me tell you about the ransom system because it reveals another dimension of how the Ottoman Empire processed religious captives. The ransom system for captured Christians was remarkably sophisticated and bureaucratic. Ottoman authorities maintained records of where captives had come from and who their families were. They assessed how much ransom might reasonably be demanded based on the captive's family wealth and status. They communicated through various intermediaries, merchants, diplomats, Christian communities within Ottoman territories, to inform families that their relatives were available for ransom at specified prices. For captured nuns, the ransom prices were typically substantial. The Ottoman authorities understood that convents often came from wealthy families, aristocratic women, who had been sent to convents as younger daughters, or who had chosen religious life but maintained connections to powerful families. They also understood that Western religious institutions, particularly the Vatican and various monastic orders, were sometimes willing to pay for the release of captured religious women. The ransom negotiations could take months or even years. Messages would be carried back and forth through intermediaries. Families would try to negotiate lower prices, claiming poverty, or attempting to convince Ottoman authorities that the captive was worth less than initially assessed. Ottoman administrators would counter with evidence of the family's wealth, or would threaten that without payment, the captive would face permanent enslavement or forced conversion. For the sisters from Thessaloniki, ransom notices were sent to their families and to religious authorities in Venice and Rome. Some families were able to pay. Sister Ekaterini's family minor aristocrats, who had some remaining wealth, managed to gather the required sum after selling properties and borrowing from relatives. Sister Anastasia's uncle, a merchant with business connections in Ottoman territories, was able to negotiate her release by paying ransom and by providing some valuable trade goods. Over a period of 2 years, 5 of the sisters who had remained resistant to conversion were eventually ransomed and released. These ransomed women made their way west, eventually reaching Christian territories, where they tried to rebuild their lives. Some returned to religious life in convents in Italy or other Western locations. Some, broken by their experiences, struggled to reintegrate into any normal existence. A few left accounts of their captivity, usually fragmentary, and filtered through the clerics who recorded their testimonies. And these accounts provide some of our most detailed information about what captive nuns experienced. But 12 of the original 23 sisters from Thessaloniki were not ransomed. Their families lacked resources to pay or had been killed during Ottoman conquest, or simply never received the messages offering ransom. For these women who had resisted conversion and who could not be ransomed, Ottoman policy dictated that they would be permanently integrated into Ottoman society through enslavement or permanent imprisonment. The term enslavement in Ottoman context requires some explanation because it differed from chattel slavery as practiced in other systems. Ottoman slavery was more similar to a condition of permanent servitude, where the enslaved person became part of a household with certain duties and restrictions, but might also have certain limited protections under Islamic law. For women, this typically meant domestic service in Ottoman households, performing cleaning, cooking, childcare, and other household labor under the authority of the household head. For former nuns, women who had taken vows of celibacy and dedicated themselves to religious life, this form of enslavement was particularly devastating psychologically. They were placed in Muslim households where they would be required to participate in daily life that violated their religious commitments. They would be present for Islamic prayers and required to show respect, even if not required to participate. They would prepare food according to Islamic dietary laws. They would observe Islamic holidays and customs. Their entire existence would be immersed in a religious context that contradicted everything they had devoted their lives to maintaining. Moreover, there was always the implicit or explicit pressure that they might eventually be required to marry. Ottoman law permitted Muslim men to marry Christian women under certain circumstances, and household heads sometimes arranged marriages for enslaved women in their households. For former nuns who had taken permanent vows of celibacy, this possibility represented not just the violation of their bodies, but the destruction of their most fundamental religious commitment. The 12 unredeemed sisters from Thessaloniki disappeared into the system of household servitude. Ottoman records note their transfer to various households in Constantinople and surrounding areas. But after these initial notations, the documentary trail ends. They joined the anonymous mass of enslaved Christian captives whose individual fates went unrecorded, whose lives continued in conditions we can infer from general descriptions but cannot document in detail, whose deaths went unmarked and unmourned except by God. This is how systematic erasure worked. Not through spectacular violence that created memorable martyrs, but through the grinding bureaucratic process of categorization, conversion ransom, or permanent enslavement that scattered captured religious women across Ottoman society until they effectively ceased to exist as distinct individuals. Their families often never learned what happened to them. Western religious authorities who might have advocated for them had no way to track individual captives once they disappeared into Ottoman households. The women themselves had no way to communicate with the Christian world or to make their continued existence known. Now, the case of the Thessaloniki convent was not unique or exceptional. What happened to Sister Theodora and her sisters happened to nuns from dozens of convents across the territories that fell to Ottoman expansion during the 15th and 16th centuries. Let me tell you about some other documented cases, because understanding the scope helps us recognize that this was not random violence, but systematic policy implemented across decades and across wide geographic areas. In 1462, 9 years after Constantinople fell, Ottoman forces took the city of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, one of the last remaining Byzantine holdouts. The city contained 7 convents, housing approximately 130 nuns. Byzantine sources chronicles written by survivors who fled west describe what happened when the city fell. The nuns were gathered from their convents and brought before Ottoman commanders who offered the same choices: conversion payment of tribute or consequences for resistance. The chronicles describe how the nuns of Trebizond responded similarly to those in Thessaloniki. Some particularly younger women eventually converted under pressure. Some were ransomed by families or religious institutions over the following years, and many disappeared into Ottoman society, their ultimate fates unknown. A Venetian merchant named Giacomo Badoer, who visited Trebizond 3 years after its fall, noted in his diary that the city's Christian population spoke quietly about the disappeared nuns maintaining small private shrines in their memory. But that open discussion was dangerous because Ottoman authorities considered the nuns' resistance to have been treasonous. In 1479, during Ottoman campaigns in Albania, multiple convents were captured in the region around Shkodër. Albanian sources from this period are fragmentary, but a letter from an Albanian nobleman to the Pope preserved in Vatican archives describes the capture of approximately 40 nuns from convents in the region. The letter, written as a plea for military assistance against Ottoman expansion, notes that the nuns have been taken into captivity and face fates that make death seem preferable. Yet we are powerless to rescue them or to prevent further captures as more territory falls. In 1498, Ottoman forces completed the conquest of Herzegovina, and sources note the capture of nuns from Orthodox convents in the region. A report from a Franciscan missionary operating in the area, sent to his superiors in Rome, describes how the local Christian population was traumatized not just by the military defeat, but by the knowledge of what was happening to captured religious women. The report notes that some families chose to kill daughters who had become nuns rather than allow them to be captured, viewing this as mercy that preserved their souls even while ending their lives. This pattern continued through the 16th century as Ottoman expansion pushed further into Europe. Convents in Greece, the Balkans, and eventually Hungary faced similar fates as Ottoman control extended across these regions. Each conquest followed similar patterns: initial offers of conversion or tribute capture of those who resisted processing through evaluation and ransom systems, and eventual dispersal of unredeemed captives into Ottoman society. The cumulative effect across decades and territories was that hundreds, possibly thousands of Christian nuns were captured and processed through these Ottoman systems. Some converted and were integrated into Ottoman society. Some were ransomed and returned to Christian territories. Many simply disappeared into enslavement or permanent imprisonment. Their individual stories lost, but their collective fate documented in the fragmented records that survived. Now let me tell you about something that has only recently been uncovered through archaeological and archival research. Evidence that some of these captive women, even after conversion or enslavement, attempted to maintain Christian faith and practice in secret, creating hidden spaces where they could continue their religious identity despite Ottoman prohibition. In 1998, during renovation work in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, archaeologists discovered a small chamber that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. The chamber, located in the basement levels where enslaved workers and servants had once lived, contained markings carved into the stone walls, crosses, Greek letters spelling out Christian prayers, dates carved in Byzantine style. Analysis of the carvings suggested they dated from the late 15th or early 16th century, precisely the period when captured Christian women would have been held in these areas. The discovery sparked interest in similar spaces, and subsequent investigations uncovered other sealed rooms and forgotten chambers in various buildings throughout Istanbul that had been part of the Ottoman palace complex. Many of these spaces contained similar markings, evidence that enslaved Christians had created secret spaces for maintaining their faith. Some of the inscriptions were in Latin, suggesting Western Christian captives. Others were in Greek, Armenian, or Serbian, representing the various Christian populations that fell under Ottoman control. One particularly significant discovery came in 2003, when researchers examining Ottoman archives found a set of documents from 1512 describing the discovery and punishment of Christian women in palace service, who were found conducting prohibited rituals in hidden chambers. The documents describe how these women had been baptizing each other in secret, maintaining Christian names alongside their Ottoman names, and teaching Christian prayers to their children in whispered sessions when they believed they were unobserved. The punishment described in these documents followed Ottoman legal principles. The women were given one final opportunity to genuinely convert to Islam and to abandon Christian practice. Those who accepted were forgiven and returned to service. Those who refused were separated from their children, who would be raised as Muslims, without further contact with their Christian mothers, and the women themselves were transferred to more restrictive conditions, where they could be more closely monitored. These discoveries have revolutionized historical understanding of captured Christian women in Ottoman territories. Previously, historians assumed that women who converted were lost to Christianity, fully integrated into Ottoman Islamic society. But the archaeological and archival evidence reveals that some maintained dual identities, outwardly conforming to Ottoman Islamic requirements, while secretly maintaining Christian faith and practice when possible. This hidden resistance represented a different kind of faith maintenance than the open defiance that led to imprisonment or death. But it was resistance nonetheless, a refusal to allow the complete erasure of Christian identity, even when survival required outward conformity. Let me tell you about one specific case that emerged from these archival discoveries, because individual stories help us understand the human reality behind the statistics and patterns. In 2007, a researcher named Ayşe Kiyalp, working in Istanbul archives, found a set of letters from the late 15th century that had been intercepted by Ottoman authorities. These letters had been written by a woman in Ottoman service who was secretly attempting to maintain contact with Christian relatives in territories that remained under Christian control. The letters were written in Greek, using a code where Christian religious terms were replaced with neutral language that would not immediately alert Ottoman censors. The woman who signed the letters with a Christian name but who was referred to in Ottoman records by an Islamic name described her situation in careful, coded terms. She wrote about being captured from a convent during Ottoman conquest, about being held in Constantinople, about being pressured to convert, about eventually accepting Islam verbally while maintaining Christian faith privately. She described how she had been placed in service to an Ottoman household, how she had been required to participate in Islamic practices, how she had eventually been married to a convert, a Christian man who had also accepted Islam, but who privately maintained Christian faith. She described how they had secretly baptized their children using water and whispered prayers, how they taught Christian beliefs to their children in carefully concealed moments, how they maintained hope that someday their children or grandchildren might be able to escape Ottoman territories and return to open Christian practice. The letters end abruptly, and Ottoman records indicate they were intercepted by authorities who were monitoring communications between Ottoman territories and Christian regions for security purposes. The fate of the letter writer and her family is not recorded, but the discovery of her intercepted correspondence in Ottoman archives suggests that authorities became aware of her continuing Christian identity and took action. This case represents just one of what were likely thousands of similar situations. Captured Christian women who outwardly conformed to Ottoman requirements while attempting to maintain Christian identity in whatever limited ways were possible. Some of these women succeeded in passing on Christian faith to their children and grandchildren, creating hidden Christian communities within Ottoman society that would surface generations later. Others were discovered and punished their hidden resistance, ending in harsher captivity or death. All of them lived with the daily psychological burden of maintaining false identities, of hiding their deepest beliefs, of never knowing whether their attempts at secret faith would succeed or whether discovery was imminent. Now let me tell you about the Western Christian response to these captures, because understanding how religious authorities and governments reacted helps us see the broader context of these events. The Pope's monastic orders and Christian kingdoms of Europe were aware that nuns and other religious women were being captured in Ottoman territories, and they attempted various responses ranging from diplomatic pressure to military campaigns to ransom operations. But these responses were limited by practical constraints and by the complex political realities of the period. The most consistent Western response was ransom payment. Various religious orders, particularly Franciscans and Dominicans, who maintained missionary presence in Ottoman territories, served as intermediaries for ransom negotiations. The Pope would occasionally pay ransom for captured religious women from church funds. Wealthy Christian families would sometimes collectively fund ransom for nuns who came from their regions. These ransom operations freed some captive women, but they were limited by available funds and by the Ottoman practice of setting ransom prices high enough that many captives could never be redeemed. Western religious authorities also attempted diplomatic approaches, sending letters to Ottoman sultans, requesting the release of captured religious women, or at least requesting that they be treated in accordance with Islamic law that theoretically protected Christians who paid jizya tax. But these diplomatic approaches were generally ineffective. Ottoman sultans rarely responded to such requests, and when they did, they typically replied that the captured women were being treated according to Ottoman law, and that their status as subjects of conquered territories meant they had no special protections beyond what Ottoman authorities chose to grant. Military responses were considered but rarely implemented. The various crusades and military campaigns against Ottoman expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries were motivated partly by desire to protect Christian populations and territories, and the fate of captured religious women was cited as evidence of Ottoman cruelty and propaganda justifying these campaigns. But practical military considerations, the difficulty of projecting power into Ottoman territories, the costs of sustained military operations, the political divisions among Christian kingdoms meant that military rescue of captured women was never a realistic possibility. Some Western religious sources from this period revealed deep frustration with the inability to protect or rescue captured nuns. A Franciscan chronicle from 1483 describes how missionaries in Ottoman territories would hear stories of captured religious women, but could do nothing except pray for them and attempt to maintain contact when possible. A letter from the Patriarch of Constantinople in exile, writing from Rome in 1497, expresses anguish at his inability to protect the nuns who had once been under his spiritual authority and who were now scattered across Ottoman territories in unknown conditions. This sense of helplessness in the face of systematic capture and forced conversion appears repeatedly in Western religious sources from the period. Church authorities understood that convents were being targeted, that nuns were being captured and processed through Ottoman systems, that Christian religious identity was being systematically attacked in conquered territories, but they lacked the power to prevent these captures or to effectively respond to them beyond limited ransom operations and diplomatic protests that were largely ignored. The psychological impact on Christians who lived near Ottoman frontiers was profound. Families became reluctant to send daughters to convents, because doing so might mean exposing them to capture if Ottoman forces advanced into the region. Some convents evacuated preventively when Ottoman forces approached, with nuns fleeing west and abandoning their institutions rather than risk capture. Other convents chose to remain, despite the risks, believing their religious commitments required them to maintain their communities regardless of danger. And these women became the ones who faced capture when Ottoman conquest reached them. Now let me tell you about how these practices eventually changed. Because the system I've been describing did not continue indefinitely in exactly the same form. As the Ottoman Empire stabilized its European borders in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and as conflict between Ottoman and Christian territories shifted from conquest to relatively stable frontier management, the treatment of Christian religious women evolved somewhat. In territories that had been under Ottoman control for multiple generations, Christian communities adapted to living under Ottoman rule. Convents in these long-established Ottoman territories often paid jizya taxes and were allowed to continue functioning under restrictions. They could maintain their communities and practice their faith, but they were forbidden from publicly proselytizing, from building new churches or convents, from ringing bells or conducting processions, and they existed in a subordinate status that acknowledged Ottoman Islamic authority. New captures of nuns became less common as frontiers stabilized because there were fewer territories to newly conquer. The dramatic episodes of convent captures that characterized the 15th and early 16th centuries, when Ottoman forces were rapidly expanding into Byzantine and Balkan territories, became rarer in the 17th and 18th centuries, when borders were more static. However, the basic Ottoman policies toward Christians, including religious women, remained fundamentally unchanged. Conversion to Islam was always encouraged and rewarded. Christians who maintained their faith were subject to various restrictions and to subordinate status. And periodic episodes of persecution, forced conversion, or capture could still occur during frontier conflicts or during periods when Ottoman authorities decided to enforce restrictions more strictly. The long-term impact of the practices I've described was profound for Christian communities in Ottoman territories. The knowledge that religious women were specifically targeted during conquest created lasting trauma and fear. Generations after the initial conquests, Christian families in Ottoman territories remained aware that religious life, particularly for women, carried risks that it did not carry in Christian territories. This awareness shaped decisions about religious vocations, about how openly to practice Christianity, about whether to maintain institutions like convents that might become targets. Modern historians studying these events have struggled with how to characterize them. Were they genocide? Were they religious persecution? Were they standard practices of empire building that happened to be directed against Christians? These questions remain debated. But what is clear from the historical record is that Ottoman policies toward captured Christian religious women were systematic, rather than random, were implemented across wide territories and over extended periods, and were designed to serve the strategic goals of establishing Ottoman control over conquered populations by breaking down religious resistance and forcing conversion or subordination. The women who experienced these policies, the thousands of nuns captured across decades of Ottoman expansion, largely disappeared from history. Most left no individual records. Their names appeared briefly in Ottoman registers or in ransom notices, and then vanished from documentation. They died in Ottoman territories in unknown locations, buried without Christian rites. Their graves unmarked and their memories preserved only in the fragmentary sources that hint at their fates, without providing complete stories. But in recent years, as historians have worked to recover the experiences of women in history, and as archaeologists have uncovered physical evidence of hidden Christian practice in Ottoman territories, these women are beginning to emerge from historical obscurity. The hidden chapel markings discovered in Istanbul, the intercepted letters revealing secret faith maintenance, the ransom records documenting individual women and their families' desperate attempts to free them, the scattered testimonies from ransomed captives who describe their experiences. All of these sources together create a picture that, while still fragmentary and incomplete, reveals the systematic nature of what these women experienced and the courage with which many of them maintained their faith, despite pressures that seem almost unbearable. Now, as we approach the end of this account, I want to tell you about one final discovery that brings us back to where we began, to Sister Theodora and the convent of the Theotokos in Thessaloniki. In 2015, researchers conducting a survey of Ottoman military records found a document from 1453 describing the capture of a convent in the hills above Thessaloniki. The document listed the number of captives, their categorization by age and condition, and their eventual disposition, how many converted, how many were ransomed, how many were transferred to permanent servitude. The document did not name the convent or the individual women, but the location date and numbers matched what fragmentary Christian sources had recorded about the Theotokos convent. Cross-referencing this Ottoman document with the Venetian correspondence from ransomed sisters, and with scattered references in other sources, historians have been able to reconstruct with reasonable confidence what happened to the 37 women who lived in that convent when Ottoman forces arrived. 3 fled before the conquest and reached safety in Venice. 11 elderly sisters, including Abbess Theodora, died during the weeks following capture. 3 younger sisters converted within 2 months and were integrated into Ottoman households. 5 sisters were ransomed over the following 2 years and returned west. And 15 sisters, nearly half the original community, disappeared into Ottoman servitude, with no further record of their fates. Their lives continuing in conditions we can infer but cannot document. Their deaths unmarked and unmourned except by God, who sees all things even when human records fail. This single convent, This single group of women represents in microcosm what happened across the collapsing Byzantine world as Ottoman expansion rolled across territories that had been Christian for more than a millennium. Each convent that fell, each group of nuns that was captured, followed similar patterns. Some women converted, some were ransomed, some died quickly, and many disappeared into the vast Ottoman Empire, where their Christian religious identities were erased from official records, even if they managed to maintain them secretly in their hearts. The story of these women is not primarily a story about Ottoman cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present. It is a story about how empires use systematic methods to break down resistance, how religious identity becomes a battleground during conquest, how women's bodies and souls become instruments through which conquered populations are controlled and subdued. It is a story about faith maintained under conditions that make faith seem impossible, about resistance that continues even when resistance seems futile, about the human capacity to maintain identity even when every external support for that identity has been stripped away. And it is a story that has been largely forgotten or ignored in mainstream historical narratives, dismissed as too difficult, too dark, too complex to integrate into simplified accounts of Ottoman expansion or Christian-Muslim conflict. But the evidence exists in archives across Turkey and Europe, in archaeological discoveries in Istanbul, in the fragmentary testimonies of survivors and witnesses. The women who experienced these events deserve to be remembered not as abstractions or as propaganda, but as real people who faced impossible choices and who responded with courage that we can only attempt to understand across the gulf of centuries. What do you think about this history? How should we remember these women as victims, as resistors, as martyrs, or as something more complex than any simple category? How do we grapple with historical events that seem designed to destroy not just bodies, but souls? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, that understanding the full scope of historical persecution is important even when that understanding is uncomfortable, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. We explore the aspects of history that are often overlooked or deliberately forgotten, bringing to light the experiences of people whose stories have been buried in archives or lost to time. The ruins of Constantinople, modern Istanbul, still stand as one of the world's great cities, its beauty and history attracting millions of visitors. Those visitors walk streets where captive Christian women were once marched in chains. They tour palaces where enslaved workers carved secret crosses into stone walls. They marvel at architecture, built partly through the labor of conquered peoples. The stones remember what happened there, even when the tourists don't know the full stories. Remember Sister Theodora, who died slowly in captivity rather than renounce her faith. Remember the 3 young women who fled west and spent the rest of their lives knowing they had survived while their sisters suffered. Remember the women who converted outwardly while maintaining Christian faith, secretly living with the constant fear of discovery. Remember those who were ransomed and returned west, carrying trauma that could never fully heal. Remember the 15 who disappeared into Ottoman servitude, their fates unknown, but their courage no less real for being unrecorded. They existed. They faced impossible choices. They suffered things that most of us cannot imagine. They maintained faith and identity under pressures designed to destroy both, and they deserve to be remembered as people, not as abstractions, not as propaganda points in religious conflict, but as women who lived and suffered and died in circumstances that history has tried to forget. These were the Christian nuns who were captured when the Byzantine world fell. These were the women who faced Ottoman systems designed to break their faith and erase their identities. These were the thousands whose individual stories are lost, but whose collective experience represents something profound about faith resistance and the human cost of religious conquest. May their memory be eternal, and may their stories finally emerging from archives and archaeological sites after centuries of silence help us understand the full complexity of historical religious conflict and the courage of those who maintained their faith, despite pressures that seem almost unbearable from our comfortable distance of centuries. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. And there are so many more stories waiting to be told.